Skończyłem szkołę podchorążych piechoty.
I graduated from the School for Infantry Cadets, where I received training in urban warfare and subversive combat.
W polu i w walkach w mieście, no i w walkach dywersyjnych.
The streets were full of young people, mostly with rucksacks or with some parcels. My conclusion was that Germans were already defeated.
Two most terrifying moments of the uprising, that noise of the Stuka, seeing the Germans' eyes and the machine gun fire coming straight at me and being completely helpless. The second one were the tanks. The noise, you knew it would never stop, and you felt like a little bug.
It lasted a very long time in Warsaw. Non-stop alarms. That cost a lot of effort and sweat.
Himmler had compared the fighting in Warsaw to the fighting in Stalingrad.
With Warsaw burning and Germans considering surrender, an uprising was called for in Paris, the capital of occupied France.
The mass retreat of the 11th German Panzer Division from the Russian front to the American sector was halted by the inhabitants of Czech Prague.
Failure of the Allied coalition to organize a rescue, having 9 weeks to do so. Warsaw could have been saved, and yet the Western powers and the Soviet Union couldn't reach an agreement, and the city was allowed to die.
Quite possibly, the city of Warsaw has never been as happy in its 700-year-old history as it was during the beautiful spring and summer of 1939. The city was the capital of a country independent then for only 21 years, after 125 years of partitions that kept Poland erased from the map of Europe.
The German occupation of Prague, capital of Czechoslovakia, left no doubt as to Germany's intentions as regards the military conquest of Eastern Europe.
September 1st, 1939. the day World War II started. The skies above Warsaw's rooftops began raining bombs of the Luftwaffe. And the German invasion made its terrifying mark on the history of mankind. Poland resisted the German aggression with bravery and sacrifice, hoping and waiting for promised French and British involvement. Instead of help, on September 17th, Poland was attacked from the east by the Red Army, as was agreed in the secret Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact prior to the outbreak of the war. The two totalitarian powers brought upon Poland destruction, cruelty, and barbarism on a scale never before experienced. On the 5th of October, Hitler attended the Victory Parade in gravely wounded Warsaw. At the beginning of the occupation, the Germans felt confident on the city's streets. Soon Warsaw would become for them one of the most dangerous cities in occupied Europe.
My blood boiled in my veins as I walked the streets of Warsaw, and any German, uniformed German who was coming on the sidewalk, I had to step into the gutter. I started believing that I was an Untermensch, I was something less than a human being.
From the first days of the occupation, Hitler's police force and the Gestapo were operative. Schuha Avenue was rebaptized Straße der Polizei, Police Street, and it was here that prisoners were beaten and tortured. November 3rd was a day of reckoning for the student Elżbieta Zahorska. She was executed for tearing down a Nazi propaganda poster that read, "England, it's your doing." Before her execution, the heroic girl made her thoughts clear by yelling in German, "Poland has not perished yet."
I was being taken to Schuha Lane in one of these black cars with 3 girls. They were asking me to, if I survived, to go and say a prayer for them, but they were going to the execution.
A year later, the fate of Warsaw was shared by other European cities.
British and American people tend to think of the Second World War in very simple black and white terms. It was a war, from their point of view, which was fully justified, a war of the good against the evil. The Warsaw Rising and other events on the Eastern Front show that the Second World War was not so simple. There were in fact two great evil totalitarian mass-murdering powers involved.
The drama of Jewish destruction began before the creation of the ghetto. Every citizen of Jewish ancestry was subjected to the torments of the occupier. The old and sick were especially tortured.
The ghetto not only was falling apart, but people are dying in the droves.
"5 years passed of nightmarish German occupation. Raids, executions, and concentration camps cost the lives of 6 million Polish citizens, including 3 million Jews. All this was happening in full view of the world, inactive in the face of this crime. On April 19th, 1943, an unequaled heroic struggle flared up in the Warsaw Ghetto. Those resistors caught armed were shot immediately in the ghetto's ruins. The others were removed from homes and cellars to be tortured and degraded by SS men, and then shot or sent to death camps. In the course of a few weeks, the city was threatened with the occupation by the Red Army.
The original plan of the Home Army leaders was to launch the rising at the moment when the Red Army, approaching from the east, came into combat with the German defenders of Warsaw.
Ostatnie dni lipca
During the last days of July, a Soviet reconnaissance tank appeared in Prague.
ukazał się zwiadowczy sowiecki.
This was proof that larger divisions had been amassing at the rear. Soviet divisions had been approaching Warsaw in ever greater numbers.
I talked in London with Winston Churchill, with Anthony Eden, with I don't know how many journalists, with the members of parliament, and I knew that Warsaw cannot expect any kind of military help.
The Wehrmacht's leadership decided to make Warsaw into a fortified city. Her defense was entrusted to the 9th Army.
We knew that we had to win back Warsaw in order to eventually hand it over to those divisions that were entering Warsaw. That is, the Soviet divisions.
In order to completely prevent the possibility of an uprising, on the 27th of July, 100,000 inhabitants were called to build fortifications. Warsavians completely boycotted the order.
It was a feverish mood of the young people who, after all, were waiting for this moment for a long time.
4 lata ćwiczeń.
4 years of training, preparation for combat.
Szereg przeszkoleń.
All this meant that we were at all times ready to follow the command to commence fighting in Warsaw.
O rozpoczęciu walk w Warszawie.
The streets were full of young people. I asked myself, how is it that Germans do not react? It's quite obvious, quite evident. The people couldn't wait until 5.
This day, this feeling was difficult even to express, because I feel that it's time it came our freedom.
Our equipment was fantastic in terms of quantity. We had 2 hand machine guns. We had Piat, that is an anti-tank weapon. We had several submachine guns and all kinds of hand grenades.
How we can stop them? It would be like somebody who's running faster and faster to jump over some high wall, and just before the wall, we tell them, stop it. This was the moment people were waiting for 5 years of the Nazi occupation, Nazi persecution.
News of the uprising drove Hitler to fury. He gave an unequivocal order to destroy Warsaw. We must kill all citizens, taking no prisoners. Warsaw must be obliterated so that in this manner, a terrifying example will be set for all of Europe.
Der Zug lief genau in.
On the first day, our train was caught under fire at the main station. I have to admit that most of the soldiers were drunk. We had a lot of alcohol, a lot of wine on the train. Suddenly, I noticed splinters. At first, I didn't know what was happening, but soon we had 2-3 bodies in the wagon.
It looked like a moment of victory, of triumph. Nobody thought about what was going to happen, really.
Over 2,000 of the uprising soldiers fell in the first battle. One of them was the nurse Krystyna Krachelska, the author of the song, "Hey Boys, Fix the Bayonets." Before the war, her face was sustained in the Warsaw statue.
The airdrops came to us from Italy and were dropped by parachute.
On the 4th day of the uprising, a bullet in the temple fatally wounded the poet Krzysztof Kamil Baczynski. Before you fell, you made the sign of the cross over the earth. Was it a bullet, my son, that pierced the heart?
Two sides of combatants were fairly equally matched. Between 45 and 50,000 insurgents took to the barricades on the 1st of August, and a similar number of German troops. The real difference was that whereas the insurgents had no heavy weapons at all,
Thousands of Warsaw's women took part in the uprising. Many of them were students, teachers, workers, and housekeepers who nursed the wounded, cooked, and supported the soldiers of the uprising.
This was a beautiful characteristic feature of our women, regardless of age, from grandmother to mother and young girl.
It was the youngest soldiers that actually destroyed the German tanks with bottles of gasoline. They also helped with the operation of heavy machine guns. Their peers, such as girls from the Scouts post surface, often had to cross German lines in order to hand over letters. These boys and girls became the symbol of fighting Warsaw.
The common fight solidified old bonds from the conspiracy years and created new ones. Maturity came earlier, and emotions also matured. Where love arose, marital bonds were tied.
The civilian population was completely behind us. They helped us in every possible way. They would share their food. They would, if we were wounded, they would hide us and take care of us.
One of the elite battalions of the Home Army, the Zoshka battalion, captured a couple of German tanks. They decided to use the tanks to storm the concentration camp at Goose Farm. They liberated the prisoners. They recruited those Jewish prisoners into their own ranks.
The 5th of August, German forces began their offensive. The word offensive, however, took on a more ominous meaning. The mass killing of the civilian population, accompanied by plunder and mass rape of women. In 2 days, 20,000 people fell victim.
All too often, they allowed themselves to turn on the civilian population, to murder, to burn.
Schreckliche Bilder. Ich weiß nicht, ob ich das überhaupt.
These were horrible sights, I have to admit. Do you know how corpses burn? There is a lot of noise and movement. You get the impression that the cadavers are not quite dead yet.
Using his excellent knowledge of German, Jan Mor Jankowski, member of the Polish Home Army, worked for the Nazi organization TOT while secretly providing information to the Polish underground.
2 or 3 of these women who had a completely burned faces. They were like blue and purple, and you couldn't see the eyes.
They put women and children and used them as human shields.
And in front of the tanks were our children, our mothers, our sisters, being herded towards our positions so that we wouldn't shoot at the tanks. But finally we had to fire. And there were 2 tanks which were firing at our positions. I was able to get one of them. The Germans started escaping through the hatch. The other tank noticed the window and he moved the gun, and I realized that I was dead unless I jumped out the window, and I was on the 3rd floor.
Wir wurden beschossen, wussten aber nicht, wer.
We were fired upon, but we did not know where the shots came from. The Poles had excellent hiding places, excellent camouflage. Many of them had German uniforms. So during the first few days, we were totally confused.
Die polnischen Soldaten trugen.
Polish soldiers were wearing typical German badges on their uniforms.
Und so wurde uns verboten, noch Stahlhelme zu tragen.
So we were forbidden to wear them to ease orientation.
An 8th-floor building of the telephone center Pasta served as a German fortress. After 3 weeks of heavy fighting, German soldiers surrendered.
I have to go to a meeting with the head of the German garrison, General Rainer Stahel, but he seems very shaken and very, very tired. He was reporting that they were surrounded, and he said, if it weren't for the telephones. If the Poles had cut the telephones, we would have all surrendered.
German soldier Kurt Heller chronicled the siege. August 5th, Rudolf killed, along with a few friends. August 6th, death awaits outside, and one wants to live. Three friends shot themselves. August 7th, 14 people killed, buried in the courtyard, bad air from the stench of death. August 13th, when will liberation ensue? August 16th, terrible hunger, fear at night. August 17th, the Poles are trying to smoke us out with fire and bottles of gas. A few people again lost their nerves and committed suicide. August 19th, liberation is hopeless. Meanwhile, with Warsaw burning and Germans considering surrender, an uprising was called for in Paris, the capital of occupied France. The action was undertaken without the acceptance or cooperation of General de Gaulle, and against the Allied strategic plans.
Wir als Pionier
We had to plant bombs.
wir mussten
We had to blow up doors, basements, walls.
Sprengungen übernehmen, Türen aufsprengen, Keller aufsprengen, Mauern durchbrechen. Und dann
That was the job of the Wehrmacht.
Die Wehrmacht, also Infanterie, aber meistens
Later,
waren es
the SS and Dirlewanger arrived.
Brigade Dirlewanger.
The Germans and their ethnic auxiliaries, mostly former Soviet citizens. In addition to them, there were criminals from the Oskar Dirlewanger Brigade, streamed into Warsaw like a horde of Huns, murdering the defenseless.
There were layers after layers after layers of people who were killed. And I saw on the street women whose clothes were torn off them. Probably they were raped by the Kaminsky troops. They were called r.o.n.a.
The leader of the r.o.n.a brigade, Kaminsky, was actually killed by the SS for excessive violence.
Imagine that. On the one side of the river, you had the Red Army with its Soviets waiting and watching as Warsaw burnt, and ex-Soviets with their Nazi commanders burning and murdering Warsavians.
General Eisenhower gave General Leclerc orders to move his armored divisions to support the Parisian insurgents. The German command in Paris refused to obey Hitler's orders to raze Paris and its symbol, the Eiffel Tower. It was precisely thanks to the support from the Allies that the Paris uprising ended in victory after just 1 week of fighting. Unlike the Parisians, the insurgents and citizens of Warsaw waited for assistance in vain.
After the slaughter of Wola and Ochota, the civilian population of the old town that suffered the most. Bombs rained constantly on them. They were shelled by the heaviest artillery, and the old town, in essence, is the tiniest quarter of Warsaw.
It was in the old town where the heavy rocket launcher, whose missiles ruined homes while burning petroleum charred people alive, was used first. Missiles of 600 millimeters and weighing over 2,000 pounds devastated city buildings to the foundations. When they began to land around the Prudential building, photojournalist Sylvester r.o.n.a consciously pressed the release button on his Leica.
Suddenly, the grenade did go right in this courtyard. The people were shouting, mostly of these girls. They were without legs, they were without hands. Some of them were killed, some of them were bleeding.
Hands sticking out, and we removed the
One boy who was shot in the left side of lungs with high temperature, I remember almost on the end of his life, he was calling, "Mother, mother, help me."
Correspondent for German weekly Das Reich wrote about the battles in the old town. Mine throwers and heavy artillery decimated the walls. Bombs from the air destroyed yards, and tanks dispersed the city's defenders with their murderous fire. "14-year-old Wanda Shabilska wrote in her diary, "On the day I was almost killed by the bomb, the coat I had on began to burn. Thankfully, I had enough presence of mind to throw the coat off, and when I did, I fainted. It was a miracle that I survived." She was killed only 1 week later.
It was probably the most tormented portion of humanity at that time.
Every day, an average of between 2,000 and 3,000 people were killed, quite apart from the fighting. Civilians in the cellars, under falling buildings, civilians caught by burning buildings, civilians massacred by the SS. 60 times as great as the World Trade.
On the 2nd of September, a spectacular exodus took place. 5,000 insurgents and 6,000 civilians were evacuated from the old town and underneath the surrounding German forces using the underground canals. The Germans tossed gas grenades into the canals, which were to become the site of Dantean scenes involving death, panic, and loss of sanity. Some of the evacuees walked straight into German traps and were executed on the spot. Maria Dymachowska, a nurse, noted in her diary, "We were 17 and 18 years old, and full of belief and faith. We were free, unafraid, and completely determined. We were going to win, and none of us would die. The most beautiful, terrible, and unforgettable days."
General Monter, who was in charge of the fightings, was planning to break through the German lines to make possible for the people who were surrounded in the old town to break through, to save their lives, and to join the center of the city.
Fierce fighting continued on both sides of Jerozolimsky Street. Here was followed the order, retreat only on stretchers.
Commander of this soldier came to Monter and said, "The street is under German fire. We will not get through, sir." And he said, "The order is the order, period. You don't count the casualties, you just go forward and implement my order." He said, "Rozkaz, panie generale." He said, "The order, yes, I will follow your order." And then, I saw this man without legs who was dying. And he said to Monter in my presence, "I did carry the order, sir."
Maria Sedis, one of the bravest women of the uprising. While critically injured, she was asked provocatively, "Are you a bandit?" "I am a soldier of the Home Army," she responded with dignity. Then she was shot.
The thing which I realized during the uprising, that the Germans were not Superman. I was not any less human than they were. That my bullet, when it hit a German soldier, would drop him as sure enough as a bullet would drop one of us.
Heinrich Himmler said, "This has been the hardest battle we have fought since the war's beginning. It is comparable only to the fight for every home in Stalingrad."
In Stalingrad, it was two professional armies. In Warsaw, there were also civilians and a bunch of underarmed guerrillas.
In the yards, on dug-up sidewalks, backyards, and everywhere were fresh graves. More and more writings could be found on the walls, informing of mass graves of people buried under the rubble. A troop of Polish soldiers, dispatched from the Red Army, crossed the Vistula River into the fighting city. Stalin formed the division from the Polish citizens released recently from the Siberian Gulag. These were poorly trained soldiers, unprepared for urban warfare.
Lądowanie oddziałów armii Berlinga
Berling's Polish army divisions landed too late. The entire coast had already been captured by the Germans. The divisions landed on heavy artillery, which decimated the troops, preventing them from reaching our side of the Vistula.
Their struggle ended in disaster.
I even warned them that there are only 6 or 7 crews in southern Italy, in Bari, and that it's very doubtful if there will be any dropping of equipment and ammunition. I was wrong in this respect, because the Warsaw Rising lasted so long, 63 days, that finally British decided to take risks, considerable risks, and to drop some ammunition, some even food and weapons.
When Churchill got extremely angry at the fact that the Soviets were obstructing the Western airlift and requested that Roosevelt join him in a joint protest, Roosevelt declined.
The whole sky was filled with parachutes and with food and weapons and ammunition, and were so overjoyed, was jumping up in the air and crying out of happiness. And it was that spirit, knowing that we're defending our sisters, our girlfriends, our mothers and our fathers, that made us fight to the last.
I realized it was unavoidable. It was coming. I knew that it was a matter of hours.
The 2nd of October, 1944, an agreement to cease military operations in Warsaw is signed.
We had to surrender, and almost in unison, all of us burst crying.
One of the key points of the capitulation agreement with the Germans was that the Home Army underground fighters should be treated as legal combatants.
Po podpisaniu kapitulacji,
After the signing of the surrender,
do obozu
I was sent to a prisoner of war camp near Hanover.
koło Hanoweru.
I was given the prisoner number 141314, Starlight 2B.
And this is, of course, an amazing, an outrageous fact that the allies of the Western powers came to be treated better by the Nazi SS than by the Soviet forces.
The war was coming to an end. The mass retreat of the 11th German Panzer Division from the Russian front to the American sector was halted by the inhabitants of Czech Prague. 200,000 German soldiers were desperate. They wanted to get into the American sector and not to fall into Russian captivity. An uprising broke out in Prague. Stalin, seeing the advance of the American army from the west, gave the order to help the uprisers. A bloodbath was avoided and Prague was liberated.
This ought to be remembered as one of the great successes of the Second World War. And the capitulation, when it came, did not come because the Home Army was totally defeated. It came because the political goals of the insurgents, namely to link up with the Red Army, were no longer
Into Warsaw marched the Russian soldiers. The frozen Vistula had separated us from the Russians. For us, it was a chance to rest, a time of silence, a rest from the bullets. Yes, it was a good time.
Failure of the Allied coalition to organize a rescue, having 9 weeks to do so, a very long time, 9 weeks in which Warsaw could have been saved, and yet the Western powers and the Soviet Union couldn't reach an agreement, and the city was allowed to die.
The Nazis left the so-called Vernichtungskommando, the destruction teams.
Und da kamen 3 Zivilisten auf mich zu.
2 civilians approached, asking, "Russian?"
Fragten die, Russek? Und ich winke nein.
No, I replied. "German?" I nodded.
Arme kleine Junge,
Poor
hast du
boy, you must be hungry.
Haben die mich
They took
mitgenommen?
me with them.
The legacy of the Warsaw Uprising is still painfully alive. The city stands on the graves of the insurgents and civilians that perished during these 63 bloodiest days in the country's history. Was the sacrifice necessary?
what came out of it. On the one hand, death, destruction, more of the romantic tradition of dying in flames for Poland. On the other hand, the heroic legacy of the struggle to the death.
And what did the uprising give Poland, if anything? And what did it take away from her? Countless and contrary opinions exist as to what, involving different points of view on history, politics, war, and peace. But perhaps these 4 short words have to suffice. Honor of the city. The uprising was a matter of honor. That's what mattered most, and that's what's best to remember, with piety and awe.
If you remember about your dead who died in the struggle of freedom, then it means you cherish the legacy of freedom and the freedom will come.
The communist authorities in Poland did everything in their power to suppress the memory of that rising and to prevent information about it. There was no monument in Warsaw to the rising until 1989.